Powell. The Right Honourable Enoch Powell, MBE, MP.
But a figure was emerging who would threaten the political consensus, the Conservative Shadow Defence Secretary.
Why are the British hag-ridden and bullied from year to year? Bullied and badgered and despised and impoverished.
To contain him, Powell was put on the committee hammering out the Tory party's line on the Race Relations Bill then before Parliament.
As far as we knew, Enoch agreed with us, although he practically never contributed to discussions of that kind. He was a silent member. I can't remember, he was absolutely silent, but basically he was silent.
But Powell did break his silence on the 20th of April 1968 in a speech at the Midland Hotel, Birmingham.
The discrimination and the deprivation, the sense of alarm and of resentment lie not with the immigrant population, but with those among whom they have come and are still coming. This is why to enact legislation of the kind before Parliament at this moment is to risk throwing a match onto gunpowder.
I was at my home at Broadstairs on the coast that Saturday evening when the phone started ringing vigorously from every press correspondent saying what were my comments about Powell's speech. And I had to say, well, I haven't seen it. He's not given us any notice of it.
Mr. Heath phoned me up and he told me what he was proposing to do, which was to ask Mr. Powell to leave the Shadow Cabinet.
I remember Ted ringing me up on Sunday morning because it was all over the Sunday papers, saying Enoch must go. And I said, look, I would just wait and just read the whole speech and just think about it for a few days. No, he must go. Everyone says he must go.
I remember saying to him, well, I wouldn't have threatened you, but now you've said that, I'm bound to tell you that if you hadn't done that, I should have resigned. And I gather I was not the only one who took that view.
They gathered in my flat in London, and we discussed it all. And everyone was absolutely agreed that he must go.
That was the end of any possibility of working with Enoch Powell as a political colleague. Frankly, we felt we could no longer trust him.
If I tried to stand by him, as one particular person has said we ought to have done at that time, she now said it, she didn't say it in my knowledge at the time, then, of course, I wouldn't have had a shadow cabinet left.
I thought it was a conclusion jumped to far too rapidly if you looked at the logic and reason in his speech.
I then asked Willie Whitelaw, who was the chief whip of the opposition, to get Enoch on the phone. So he came back and said Enoch, as far as he could find out, was in Wolverhampton and he hadn't got a telephone. So I then said, well, they get hold of his agent in the constituency and get the agent to bring him to a telephone. Well, that was finally arranged. And I then said, I'm afraid that his colleagues just couldn't accept this speech. And there was no alternative but for him to go. And he said very well and went.
When you hear some skinhead lout shouting it outside a public house at closing time, that's bad enough. But when it comes from a man in pinstripe trousers and a Homburg hat, who's been a professor of Greek and a brigadier in the British Army and a Tory cabinet minister, somehow it gives it an air of respectability. And that was what was so wicked.
Heath, to sack him, was taking a very bold move which very large numbers of active Conservative supporters profoundly disagreed with. And if he hadn't done it, I do think there's a chance that the course of British politics and the place that racism might have played in British politics would have been very different from what it has been.
Well, it was one contribution which I made, yes. But I wouldn't say it was the most important. In its own sphere, it was important, yes.
The dockers marched in support as Enoch Powell's speech echoed across the country. Emboldened, Powell was to cast himself as a prophet in the political wilderness. His sermons were to challenge the fragile consensus on race for years to come.
People say they support Enoch Powell, 88%.
If you look at it from the point of view of history, Powell's speech was the seminal moment.
It made him the most popular politician in England.
Within 3 days of the speech, MPs faced a spontaneous mass demonstration by Powell's supporters.
Many people in the country rose to Enoch. You remember, the London dockers loved him.
Thousands of dock workers marched on the Houses of Parliament on the day MPs were due to debate a new law on race relations.
They had a slogan, knock, knock, we want Enoch.
Brian and Michael Foot and I and Shelley Williams and a lot of other people were all together watching this.
Michael Foot, the noblest of men, and especially on this issue, couldn't believe that these proletarian Labour voters could possibly hold such horrendous views.
There was a kind of idealisation of the British worker within the intellectual wing of the Labour movement, which saw the British worker as being incapable of intolerance, racism and so forth.
We're not racialists. We told him that this was just a minute snowball that would go down the hill and get larger, larger, and larger.
One docker with a bullhorn outside the House of Commons said, "We're very tolerant down at the docks, but when our women are threatened, we stand up." And I remember Michael saying, "What on earth is he talking about?"
Some might have risen to him because they had prejudices, but those prejudices were not there in Enoch Powell.
The most senior Labour and Conservative figures were more irritated than surprised by the high-profile race now had.
They were expressing, in a demonstrative way, disquiet that I knew they had had for a very long time. This was nothing new to me. I wasn't learning anything new from these demonstrations at all.
As far as the dockers were concerned, well, dockers have their views and they march and express them very strongly. But the country isn't governed by dockers. So that didn't change our position in the least.
Pray silence, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, for the Right Honourable J. Enoch Powell.
With over 1,000 non-white immigrants entering the country each week, Powell continued to campaign. Both Labour and the Conservatives distanced themselves from his inflammatory rhetoric, but they were reluctant to alienate his many supporters. Their compromise was to embrace the equation at the core of Powell's argument, but to express it in politically acceptable terms.
The line was, minimise the immigration, then there'll be so few, everyone can be relaxed, and then we can not have discrimination. I mean, that was really the argument.
The smaller the numbers of the strangers who come amongst us, the easier it is to treat them exactly as ourselves.
People have not got confidence that the government have got a grip on the situation as far as fresh immigrants are concerned. Now, this concerns me because I want to see good race relations, and I do not believe you can have good race relations unless people have got confidence that the situation is under control.
If we were to have an open door to them at the end of the day, then it would mean such an influx that our social services, our housing, our whole environment in some of our big towns and cities would be congested and overloaded to the point where it would be impossible to carry out one of the most difficult problems any country's had to do in recent times, and that is to assimilate the immigrants among our own population.
It may have been politically convenient to follow Powell's line that tough immigration control was the key to fostering positive race relations, but there was a risk.
If your immigration restrictions are too repressive, you encourage bad race relations rather than encourage contentment and satisfaction. Because you are saying we can't afford any more of these people here, and the implication is there's something undesirable about these people.
What's the coon doing here?
By the 1970 general election campaign, both parties feared that outright public attacks on Powell could lose them the election. But one member of Wilson's cabinet was unwilling to soft-pedal.
The final proof of Powell's power is that Heath dare not attack him publicly, even when he says things that disgust decent Conservatives.
I decided that the right thing to do was to come out not only again on the main question, but to link it to fascism.
The flag of racialism, which has been hoisted in Wolverhampton, is beginning to look like the one that fluttered 25 years ago over Dachau and Belsen.
Larry Harris put Mr. Benn's attack to him for campaign report.
The most evil feature of Mr. Powell's new conservatism is the hatred it is stirring up.
I'll answer the question very briefly indeed, for part of it was answered by the reaction of the ordinary men and women who heard the reported remarks. But I beg your pardon? Well, I heard it, and people can judge for themselves what the reaction is. And people can judge for themselves what the reaction of the British public is, too.
This issue, because it is so important, not just in this country, but in the world in which we live, has got to be an issue in this election, and we have got to make it so.
Of course, it infuriated Harold Wilson, who didn't want this question on the agenda. He said later that I lost hundreds of seats for Labour, or thousands of votes, I forget what it was.
The Queen has asked me to form the next government, and I am indeed proud to accept.
Many felt that Powell did help the Conservatives to victory.
Well, those are the Powellites. Those are his supporters. There's no evidence of that.
I personally think Enoch was always an asset. Always an asset.
In government, the Conservatives were swift to introduce a new immigration law.
Legislation will be introduced on Commonwealth immigration.
It's a tough act. Here is Edward Heath taking a brave stand against building up racist feeling, xenophobic feeling, but also agreeing to and permitting the 1971 Act.
The new law was designed to make good the Conservatives' tough promises and to put a lid on race as a political issue. It restricted the right to live in the UK to people whose parents or grandparents were British. Very few non-white Commonwealth citizens qualified.
It was, in a real sense, a piece of racist legislation covered up by the grandparental clause, but what it really meant was that if you're white you can come in, and if you're not white you can't.
Well, I mean, only discriminatory if you're saying that people who don't qualify on this basis aren't able to come. That's not discriminating against them as individuals. It's just saying, well, these are the people that we're prepared now to accept.